a program by, for, and about women today with Sandra Elkin.
Good evening and welcome to Woman. Tonight we're going to discuss a theory of androgyny, its meaning and its possibilities. My guest this evening is Joan Bean. Joan is Dean of Wheaton College in Norton, Massachusetts. She's also a professor of psychology. She is the co-author of Beyond Sex Role Stereotypes, Toward a Psychology of Androgyny. Welcome, Joan.
Thank you.
One of the things that just really drove me crazy researching this show was the various definitions of androgyny that I ran into as I was reading various people's books. There seems not to be a consensus.
I think you're right. There is not a consensus in any sense of the word because it's been used in such a variety of ways. For example, the concept itself is as old as the Greeks. Andro, the first part of the word, means male. GYN means female. And the Greeks thought about it in terms of a hermaphrodite, that is, an individual who had both male and female characteristics. And one of the problems with that Greek definition is essentially that when the Greeks thought of this construct, it was a mythical creature. And in the contemporary sense, we would like to think about it as a very real person. But androgyny historically has come from the Greeks into the Renaissance, so that in the Musée des Cluny in Paris, you can see the old Book of Hours, which has a representation of male and female throughout the whole book itself. And so if you think of it as going almost all through time into Jungian, when Jung was generating his theory, essentially he has an androgynous part to it, where the anima, the female part, was the opposite of the male. That is, a male was confronted in his lifetime in integrating that. The female had the male part, which was the animus, which was to be integrated in a mature person, to be what Jung would call, in some ways, a self-fulfilled or self-actualized adult. And it even occurs, as you probably know, in the Bloomsbury group with Virginia Woolf on through to 1971, when Sandra Bem, a psychologist at Stanford University in the summer of 1971, asked the question, where have all the androgynous people gone? Historically, I think they've always been with us. It's just that social scientists really have not recognized them for a variety of reasons that we might be able to get into at this point, but maybe it might be better to continue with the definition.
Well, I want to know what your working definition is. I mean, you have written a book on the subject, and what you think androgyny, how it applies to us.
Androgyny, in the way that we've used it, is a relatively scientific definition. That is, we are thinking of it in terms of a balance of male and female characteristics. Only the balance isn't static. It's really a dialectic. It's an interaction between the masculine parts of people and their feminine parts. And we've added another dimension, which we call transcendence. That is, where people move out of what have been those polar ends, masculine and feminine, to another plane that brings those two together. It's a little bit hard to talk about because we don't have the linguistic symbols. For example, if you say that dependency has been typically the female part of a pole, let's say of a personality trait, and independence has been the male part of the pole, how do you bring those two together to talk about them in a transcendent sense? The interdependence doesn't quite work. There isn't a word that you can think about that represents both the thesis and the antithesis of a particular characteristic and synthesizes them together. So the symbols present us with some real problems. That's why even when you try to think visually of how you would present an androgynous being, you're really at a loss because that person is moving from male to female and female to male all the time. And there isn't a way to think of it as a static, single visual or verbal symbol. I'm not even sure that if we had the linguistic symbols, they're too static to really think in terms of, because the process of being or becoming androgynous is really a dialectic process. where one is moving between the other all the time without losing the characteristic that you're talking about.
Well, why are we thinking so much about this at this point in time? I mean, we're beginning to see articles in popular magazines. There are now 3 books on the market, including yours, which are selling rather well on the subject. We keep hearing writers refer to androgyny, androgynous characters, and so on. What's happening to make it such a hot subject at the moment?
I think that we've been searching, or at least, well, women have been searching for a model for a longer time than social scientists have been searching for it. But there's an interesting history to sort of lead up to what you've just asked me. The history is that if you only look at things in dichotomies, let's take masculine and feminine, which has been of interest to psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, and writers for a long time, nobody had been ever able to characterize what happened if you weren't either one of those, male or female. What if you fell someplace in between, in the middle?
And there were people who
And there were people who did that. And there were some individuals, in fact Abraham Maslow writes about them, really mature, coping, creative, productive people seemed to have, although he didn't have any empirical data, seemed to have the characteristics of both male and female. There were some empirical data that nobody thought about interpreting as androgynous. Frank Barron at the University of California did some research on highly creative people, engineers, architects, artists, mathematicians, okay, from both what might be viewed as being very male kinds of careers and very female types or contents in careers. And he found that highly creative people, if you were a female mathematician and you took what it's still called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the old MMPI, and it had on it a scale of masculinity, femininity. And he discovered that these highly creative people, defined so by their peers, were in fact, would show up as the opposite on these tests when you looked at this particular scale. So in effect, what he found was that very creative people in our society turned out to have characteristics that were in fact masculine and feminine. In fact, it's a nice support for the fact that androgynous people have been with us for a long time. It's just that we've never seen them as being those kinds of people. Or if you look at the book that was written by Getzels, Cradles of Eminence, looking at 400 eminent people, and you read excerpts from biographies, autobiographies, diaries, people frequently describe themselves as having the characteristics of males and females. And writers write about them as if it were the case that behaviorally they had those characteristics in addition to simply a psychological or an internal.
What does androgyny have to do with one's sexual preference? Is that one of the sort of misunderstandings about androgyny, that it is homosexuality or bisexuality or something like that?
Yes.
Yes.
Or it's simply the case that people think of it as unisex, you know, and how dull that would be. I mean, how really that would be certainly not anything interesting. Unisex is not a construct that's associated with androgyny really in the way that we've used it, nor in the way that other people have used it in contemporary terms. But I think some people have interpreted it as being that, or they've interpreted it as being bisexual. In our book, we do not deal with the sexual aspects for a number of reasons. First of all, our laboratories are simply not sophisticated enough to look at the relationship between hormones and sexual behavior or sexual preference. John Money at Johns Hopkins University has done a great deal to look at what happens when infants and older with endocrinological problems and you carry out a surgical procedure in addition to counseling. What is the most powerful variable that shapes sexual preference or sexual behavior or simply sex-type behavior? And I would say, although I'm not sure he would agree with me, my interpretation of his work is that it's really the environment. And that shapes a great deal of what is sexual preference. With regard to how you would apply androgyny, I really honestly feel it's too soon to tell. I don't know. I mean, is it the case that certainly Freud would have argued that the androgynous person is indeed the bisexual person? That's an early stage in development where we are in fact bisexual. We really have not even grappled with it, mostly because I feel that we're just beginning to probe the promise of androgyny, and that we don't want to get carried away in a sense of saying, hey, here's a model and let's sell it abroad. It happens to be one model that right now is very attractive.
Well, did you begin to be interested in, and begin to study it because you saw it as a solution?
I saw it as a way, and if there's this old shtick in psychology, that one always researches the things that have either provided you with some conflict in your own life, or that there are things that unconsciously you really are trying to work out for yourself. I'm not sure that that has any reality, but clearly, as a woman, spending 17 years at home child rearing and now going through a real career change by going to graduate school, my sense was I had been in what had been a very traditional female role, and I was now moving into a very competitive area of academia, learning how to be a researcher, learning how to do computer and data analysis, and the integration of those two parts of my life were, well, they occupied a lot of my psychic energy, to say the least. But in addition to that, I was interested in how to fit those two things together. I'd been part of a two-person career, that is, where I was part of a man who was making it in the world, and now I was stepping out to do that other side. So I was interested in how one might fit those together. And there weren't any models. I mean, we didn't have them.
Right, that's true.
You were
I mean,
one
that's
or the
one
other.
of the questions that lots of women are asking.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how do I solve that dilemma? So you see androgyny as an answer for us.
I see it as an answer, cautious. I'm cautious about it. I'm cautious for a number of reasons. One is that the radical feminists have really had a superb critique of us. That is, of the model of androgyny. However,
maybe you should talk about the model before you talk about their critique.
Okay. The model itself came about as a function of Sandra Bem's interest. In a sense, she really is our foremother at Stanford. And when she generated the question, where have all the androgynous people gone, she decided that being a psychologist, one place to put your political M&Ms is into your own research. To make it, instead of a rhetorical argument, rhetoric, to really do some empirical, that's really what she'd been trained to do some experimental research. So what she did was to construct a scale called the Bem Sex Role Inventory, where she generated a set of descriptive adjectives that ranged from what might be viewed as very masculine, aggressiveness, to feminine, submissiveness, to some neutral descriptors. That was in 1972. And the first thing she did was, let's see whether there are any around. And the operational definition then of the theory of androgyny is, as you take this scale, you describe yourself, like this describes me most of the time, or least of the time, or not at all. If you equally endorse male and female characteristics on this instrument, this scale, then you are androgynous operationally. Now, there have been some fights about this. It was done early on. Mm-hmm. It was the first breakthrough. People are still using it. And it's been really a major shift in psychology to move away from the masculine and feminine polar ends, okay? It's one way. It may be a weak way, but there's still a lot to recommend it, because the nice way of validating the whole theory and the scale is to say, okay, so you have 1/3 of your people are androgynous. It turns out, by the way, that's of all her college sample at Stanford in a local community college. 1/3 of her sample is androgynous, okay? 1/3 is sex typed, that is, you're male and you're masculine on the scale, or you're female and you're feminine on that scale. And the other set is sex reversed. And that's very interesting, because most of the sex reversals are with women, where they're endorsing more male characteristics than they are endorsing female characteristics. Anyway, once she had done that, that was a step one. The next step was to see if behavior had anything to do with the scale. So what she did was to try and set up what might be viewed as, again, masculine and feminine experimental settings. So if you know somebody's androgynous, let's see how they handle a mechanical task, okay, a female. Or let's see how a male handles holding a new baby and taking care of a new baby for about 5 or 8 minutes. Okay, those are two. albeit psychologists think of sometimes some very pseudo arrangements, but at least that was an experimental and controlled way to see, does this scale have anything real to do with behavior? And what happened was she found that androgynous people in her sample, already defined by the scale, could engage in both those tasks with equal ease. That is, males could handle babies.
Who she was using for the test group, were they aware that they had these qualities?
I don't think they were aware in the sense that one, in doing experimental research, one doesn't say, what we're now going to do is, I want to see if you're going to behave in an androgynous way. You usually don't say much about what the experiment is about.
No, but I mean the people involved in the experiment, the subjects. I mean, did they see themselves any differently?
I don't know, and typically, of course, psychologists don't do follow-ups like that after experiments. I mean, it's a lovely thing to do, to say, hey, what did you think this was about? What did you think this study was about? And sort of get a bee on what kinds of things they had in their head. And I would suspect that if you took the BEM sex role inventory, you might view it as simply a personality inventory. It might not appear to have anything related to sex roles itself. And that's always a problem. I mean, you know, how naive are the subjects? Yeah, well,
I was just curious to know how aware they were that they were operating slightly differently than from what we have considered as the norm.
Eventually, they knew very well because, of course, she's published her research every place, in addition to being around the country a great deal. And then the next thing she did was to look at, okay, let's see what sex type people do in these situations. And in the task mechanical, males who were high sex type identified males very comfortably did the mechanical task, but were terribly uncomfortable, and some simply could not tolerate. Some simply refused to deal with this infant who was essentially to be cared for something like 5 to 8 minutes. Women who were high sex typed in feminine ways had no trouble handling the female infant, okay, but had a great deal of trouble dealing with the mechanical aspect of the task. There was one very striking thing that happened in this set of experiments, and that was that high sex type females and high sex type males really had a great deal of difficulty relating to peers who needed help. I mean, just simply like your roommate comes to you and wants your support for something that's happened at home, or they've just split up
how do you account
with their
for
girlfriend. It's unique in a sense that a number of people, including BEM, and we have argued the same, that high sex type people have a lot of difficulty because they're rigidly stereotyped. The flexibility is very slim for them. They can't move between that masculine and feminine task that she set up. Once you set up the situation, what surprised us was that the females were not more supportive in a kind of cry for help. You know, I need help, will you please help me? That they were not more supportive. But it sort of suggested at one level that people who are high sex stereotype have a lot of trouble either supporting other people, and Paul Musson is another person at Berkeley who's done a lot of research historically, although he would never interpret his data this way. When you follow up males in the longitudinal Berkeley growth studies, which are old and important studies in psychology, males who are high sex identified at adolescence turn out not to be quite so healthy psychologically by the time they're at middle age.
So you're saying, I guess, you know, what all this leads up to in the book and everything is that we would be in better shape as individuals and as a society if we were more androgynous, or if we were androgynous rather than so totally masculine defined and feminine defined.
Essentially, that is what I'm saying. Although being a not atypical academic, I want to immediately cut that off and say but. But the generalization is pretty much there. Now, I keep thinking to myself, we're currently writing another book, I keep thinking to myself things like, there may be more models than we even have a sense of yet. This is number one. There may be 2 or 3 in the offing, but this is the one we're trying to grapple with here. It looks very provocative.
But it's very threatening, right?
I think it's very threatening in the sense that when you look at, for example, clinical populations, women who are really trying to get their androgynous persons together are having a lot of difficulty doing that.
Well, are there people who are consciously trying to do that and labeling it as such?
I don't think so, because I don't think yet that there is as much awareness of the sort of androgynous consciousness that we would think about.
That's a thing I'd like you to do, because when we were talking earlier, you mentioned things to me that you felt, aspects of society and even people that you felt were androgynous, and you know, things that never would have occurred to me. And I think the realization that it is around us to a larger extent than we had managed is you know, incredible. Very consciousness raising, I think.
I think it's very surprising when you think in terms of, for example, Dan Levinson's work with males. When I think in terms of the work that I did with corporation executives, that male corporation executives who are judged as being successful by their peers, much like I use the same kind of method that Barron used in the creativity study, were in fact the androgynous males. That is, they had both male and female characteristics. So, and if you think about it for a moment, in order to be a successful manager, executive, organizer, you have to be interpersonally skilled with individuals, you have to be cooperative, but you also have to be a fairly authoritative person, you have to be a decision maker, but on occasion you have to be submissive, you have to be aggressive, and if you put it all together into some conglomerate, you could argue that androgyny is the best of both worlds. You really are bringing together those positive things about males and females that allow for creativity, success. In fact, there's some early data that high IQ males and high IQ females may indeed be androgynous. And that's interesting because we haven't even started to talk about what would the development of an androgynous kid look like over time. I mean, what would be a new developmental model of how an individual would learn androgynous behavior? We have some little sense of that.
Don't you think there's some evidence of that in the present youth culture? Rock, as the specifically rock.
I think one could look at sort of external characteristics, some of the sense of dress, of hair, of colors, of softness. Of course, I'm always wary of looking at that as also a reflection of attitudes and behavior, because I think it can sometimes be a little bit surprising, both in our expectations for what that might mean. But I think that I see some evidences of moving that way. Just the idea that women are seriously considering careers or trying, and I say trying, to integrate those feminine characteristics of compassion and caring into competence in competition. I mean, those are areas that I think are really, people are working hard with, and they know the notion of androgyny in some ways seems totally irrelevant. But the fact that they're trying to integrate those parts of their lives, I think, is very important. Being at a women's college, it's interesting to see the shift historically when I look back and read older records about what the alumni from Wheaton College are doing and what I see our students in last year's annual report doing. It's remarkable. I mean, the change and the shift is so startling that it almost in 4 years, the turnaround into careers and moving out and long-term commitments is a stunning thing to say.
Joan, can you be specific about the benefits to the individual? Say we did as a society, and it seems to me not too
First of
likely
all,
that
I
we're going
would
to do
say
this right away, but
flexibility.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is a very trivial example, but think in terms of being in a restaurant and a waiter is obnoxious or a waitress is obnoxious to you, and you're sort of a passive female, and I mean, that guy or woman should really get some feedback, right? But you have to have your act together in order to do that. You have to do a little risk taking, make it kind of a scene. I think that that's a very simple example of, if you're rigid, you know, if you're really locked into being a passive lady, you're not going to do that. You're going to put your white gloves on.
Would you
and
go
leave.
so far as to say that that possibly a move toward androgyny might be more beneficial to women than to men? Not more beneficial, but more readily accepted by women than by men?
I've argued something like that.
We
Okay?
only have 2 minutes.
I know. And that's a big question.
Yeah.
My sense is that women have, in a sense, been more flexible. They've had to learn more behaviors, okay? And in learning more behaviors, their adaptability may be greater than males. Okay? They have models around them of both male and female. So do males, but males know very early on that in order to make it, they're going to have to commit themselves to some kind of career. I mean, they don't have a choice. Women don't know that. But they learn how to manipulate themselves through the environment, to deal with all kinds of inputs from the environment, and to move with situations, perhaps sometimes a little bit too much. And perhaps they will have an easier time integrating and moving towards the model of androgyny. Males may have a lot more difficult time.
I want to talk about, in terms of, we only have 1 minute now, mental health. I mean, you obviously see that an androgynous person would be more mentally healthy.
I would, because you have greater degrees of freedom for individuality. You're not locked into a stereotype essentially that says to you, hey, you can't do that, you're a woman. Or to a male, you can't do that, that's woman stuff. And I think in that sense, to be able to shift and to be flexible in a society that hopefully will allow you that flexibility, and that's another issue, we didn't talk about institutions and how they control that behavior, is really indeed a healthier way to be. It allows you more room to move. And I think that's critical in this contemporary society. The one thing we know is going to be with us is change. And if you can move with that, instead of being locked into a role, I think that the advantages for growing and being are simply much greater.
Joan, thank you. I think I understand a little bit more than when I started. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching, and good night.
This program was produced by WNED-TV, which is solely responsible for its content. Major funding was provided by public television stations. Additional support was provided by unrestricted general program grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Ford Foundation.